father trying to rebuild his life after the horrors of war finally finds peace in a quiet neighborhood with his daughter. Until one fateful night, a group of intruders forces him to awaken the deadly instincts he thought he'd buried forever. But what they didn't know was that his past holds a secret that changes everything. Carlos adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, stealing a glance toward the small living room where Sofia sat cross-legged on the carpet, coloring. The bright hues on her page reflected the calm he worked so hard to cultivate, though it felt fragile, as if one sharp gust could shatter it. The world outside their modest home seemed equally serene. The neighborhood's silence was punctuated only by the faint chatter of a distant television and the rhythmic bark of a dog a few houses down. Their days followed a carefully constructed routine. Carlos would prepare breakfast, always making Sofia's favorite pancakes, then walk her to school before heading to his job at the repair shop. In the evenings, they would play card games or read together, Carlos soaking in her laughter like sunlight after a long winter. He never let her see his moments of hesitation, when the sound of breaking glass on television made his heart race, or when a sharp noise outside caused him to instinctively check the locks. Life here was meant to be safe, free from the chaos he had known. Yet the shadows of his past clung to him, whispers of distant gunfire and smoke that refused to dissipate. That morning, as Carlos walked Sofia to school, he noticed something unusual. A car, unfamiliar and battered, idled at the corner of their street. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but the low hum of its engine followed them as they turned toward the schoolyard. Carlos felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to dismiss it. This was a good neighborhood. Things like that didn't happen here. Returning home, he found solace in mundane tasks, mowing the lawn, repairing a loose hinge on the back door, and chatting briefly with Mrs. R0bbers, their elderly neighbor who always greeted him with a smile and a plate of empanadas. Her chatter about the upcoming community fair grounded him, pushing away the unease he'd felt earlier. Still, as evening approached, he couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. He had lived too long under the weight of vigilance to misinterpret that prickling at the back of his neck. Carlos double-checked the doors and windows before dinner, ensuring Sofia didn't notice his distraction. While they played cards later that night, he tried to lose himself in her joy, focusing on her bright giggles as she claimed victory. But the faint sound of footsteps outside made him tense. He glanced toward the window but saw nothing. Just a raccoon, he told himself, though his tone betrayed him. When Sofia fell asleep, Carlos stayed awake, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen. His hands cradled a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. He stared at the window, its thin curtains swaying slightly in the breeze. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet, yet it felt different now, less inviting, less secure. Carlos shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. He needed to trust this peace, even if it felt precarious. But as he finally turned off the light and headed to bed, the unsettling thought lingered. Peace, he had learned, was often the calm before the storm. The room reeked of stale smoke and cheap beer, the air heavy with the faint hum of a static-filled TV. Marco sat at the head of the worn-out table, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the hand-drawn map laid before him. Surrounding him were 3 men, his crew, each radiating a mix of arrogance and impatience. They had worked together long enough to trust each other, but not so long that respect had grown beyond their shared ambition. Easy pickings, Marco said, tapping the map with a nicotine-stained finger. His voice carried the sharpness of authority. Single dad, 1 kid, quiet guy, no alarms, no cameras, it's perfect. One of the younger men, Paolo, smirked as he leaned back in his chair. A family man? Come on, Marco, what's he gonna do? Wave a spatula at us? The group erupted in laughter, but Marco didn't join in. Instead, he lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply as his eyes fixed on the map. Underestimating people is how you get caught, or worse. His tone silenced the room. Stick to the plan. In and out, quick and clean. Clean, muttered Luis, the oldest of the group. His voice dripped with sarcasm. You sure about that, boss? Feels too quiet. These suburban types, sometimes they're hiding something. Marco exhaled a cloud of smoke, waving off the concern. It's a simple job. We go tonight. No mistakes. As the others nodded, Marco leaned back, his mind already spinning through the logistics. He wasn't one for paranoia, but something about this target felt different. Not wrong, just different. Still, he pushed the thought aside. A man like Carlos wouldn't pose a threat, and Marco was determined to make this job their cleanest yet. Across the neighborhood, Carlos stood on his porch, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. He watched as a pair of joggers passed by, their rhythmic steps fading into the distance. It was normal. All of it was normal. But the nagging unease in his chest refused to leave. The same car from earlier idled down the street again, its headlights dimmed. Carlos squinted, his instincts tugging at him. Yet he couldn't bring himself to act. What would he even do? Call the police over a hunch? He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. It was probably nothing. Inside, Sofia sat cross-legged on the couch, humming softly as she pieced together a jigsaw puzzle. The sight of her eased Carlos's nerves slightly. She was his anchor, his reason for every step he'd taken to leave his past behind. But that past, it didn't leave quietly. Carlos closed the door and locked it, testing the handle twice before retreating to the kitchen. He filled a glass of water, staring blankly out the window. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, heavy and impenetrable. Suddenly, a muffled laugh echoed from the street. Carlos froze, his grip tightening around the glass. Peering through the curtains, he caught a glimpse of movement, shadows flitting across the yard before disappearing behind the neighbor's fence. His first instinct was to act, to confront whatever danger might be lurking, but he stayed rooted, forcing himself to rationalize. It's nothing, he told himself again, swallowing hard. Maybe neighborhood kids, maybe stray animals. He returned to the living room, forcing a smile as he ruffled Sofia's hair. "Time for bed, kiddo," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. As he tucked her in, his unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that this night wouldn't end as peacefully as it began. The sound came first, a sharp, splintering crack that pierced the silence of the night. Carlos bolted upright, the haze of sleep evaporating instantly. His ears strained in the darkness, and for a moment, there was only the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of leaves outside. Then came another sound, footsteps, deliberate and heavy, moving through the lower floor. Every muscle in Carlos's body tensed. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was in the house. He slid silently out of bed, his feet barely brushing the floor as he moved toward Sofia's room. She was still sound asleep, her small figure curled under the blankets. Carlos crouched next to her bed, gently shaking her shoulder. "Sofia," he whispered, his voice calm but urgent. "Wake up, sweetheart." Her eyes fluttered open and she frowned sleepily. "What's wrong, Dad?" "Shh. I need you to be very quiet, okay?" He helped her up, guiding her toward the small wardrobe in the corner of the room. Opening the door, he pushed aside the neatly folded clothes and gestured for her to climb inside. "Stay here," he said, his tone firm but reassuring. "No matter what you hear, you don't come out until I say it's safe. Understand?" Wide-eyed, she nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly as she slipped into the cramped space. Carlos closed the door, leaving it open just a crack. He hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the wood, before steeling himself and stepping back into the hall. The sounds downstairs grew louder now, drawers being yanked open, glass clinking, muffled voices. Carlos's mind raced. He needed to assess the situation, but more importantly, he needed to protect Sofia. Years of training kicked in as he moved silently toward the staircase, keeping to the edges where the wood wouldn't creak. He crouched low, peering around the corner. The dim light of a flashlight swept across the living room, illuminating two figures rifling through drawers and shelves. A third man stood by the shattered window, his silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Carlos inhaled slowly, his thoughts crystallizing into a single, clear objective: keep them away from Sofia. The leader, Marco, though Carlos didn't know his name yet, spoke in a low, sharp tone. "Hurry it up. Grab the cash, jewelry, anything small and valuable. We're not here all night." Paolo, the younger one, scoffed. "This guy doesn't even have anything good. What a waste." "Just stick to the plan," Marco snapped. Carlos's hand brushed against the banister, his fingers tightening around the smooth wood. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his movements remained measured. He backed away from the stairs, retreating to the kitchen. If he could create a diversion, something to lure them away from the stairs, he might buy enough time to figure out his next move. Spotting a ceramic dish on the counter, he carefully lifted it and hurled it toward the far side of the kitchen. It shattered on the floor with a loud crash. and the intruders froze. "Upstairs?" Paolo whispered, his voice wavering slightly. "No," Marco growled. "Kitchen." The sound of footsteps heading toward the kitchen sent a jolt of adrenaline through Carlos. He moved quickly, slipping into the shadows of the hallway as the beam of a flashlight swept into the room. They were searching for him now. The house was no longer safe, and neither was the illusion of peace he had worked so hard to build. Carlos crouched in the dark hallway, his breath steady but shallow. Every movement had to count. His mind worked rapidly, recalling lessons learned long ago, lessons he'd hoped to never need again. The kitchen light flickered on, casting long shadows down the hallway as one of the intruders stepped in, his boots crunching over shards of ceramic. "Come on out," the man called, his voice mocking. "We know you're here." Carlos's grip tightened around the blunt screwdriver he had grabbed earlier from a utility drawer. It wasn't much, but it was enough if used correctly. He couldn't engage them all at once. He had to divide them, destabilize their confidence. He noticed the intruder's partner lingering near the doorway, the faint outline of a weapon in his hand. Carlos crept along the edge of the wall, keeping his steps silent. His heart hammered as he neared the edge of the room, but his focus remained razor-sharp. Then he struck. With a swift, calculated motion, Carlos lunged from the shadows, slamming the screwdriver into the man's dominant hand. The intruder cried out, dropping the flashlight as Carlos twisted the weapon loose and shoved him into a cabinet, rendering him unconscious. The light rolled across the floor, its beam creating wild patterns on the walls. "What the Luis?" shouted Marco from the living room. Heavy footsteps thundered closer. Carlos grabbed the downed man's weapon, a crowbar, and retreated into the pantry, breathing silently as he pressed his back against the shelves. Marco stormed into the kitchen, his flashlight darting over the room as he barked orders to Paolo. "Stay sharp. He's not just some scared dad," Marco muttered, his tone tight with irritation. "We underestimated him." Carlos listened intently, catching the tension in Marco's voice. They weren't prepared for this. He could use that. But first, he needed to keep Sofia safe. Her hiding spot upstairs weighed on his mind, a fragile tether keeping him from fully committing to the fight. Every second he delayed was another second she was at risk. Paolo's voice broke his thoughts. "We should just grab what we can and go. This isn't worth it." Marco snapped. "We leave when I say we leave. That man is a problem now, and I don't leave problems behind." The words sent a chill through Carlos. They weren't going to leave quietly, not anymore. He needed to buy more time. His eyes scanned the pantry, landing on a bottle of cooking oil. A plan formed quickly, crude but effective. He unsealed the bottle and tilted it over the floor, letting the oil spread across the tiles in a glossy sheen. Then, as quietly as he had entered, he slipped out the back door, circling toward the living room windows. Inside, Paolo edged into the kitchen, his footsteps hesitant. "It's slippery in here," he muttered, his flashlight catching the reflective puddle. "You're jumpy," Marco said, his frustration mounting. But the moment Paolo took another step, he slipped violently, crashing into the counter with a loud curse. Carlos used the distraction, smashing the living room window with the crowbar and drawing Marco's attention. The leader spun toward the sound, cursing under his breath. Carlos moved swiftly back to the shadows, adrenaline coursing through him. He'd bought precious seconds, enough to set the next trap. The intruders were on edge, but they weren't done yet. Neither was he. This wasn't about winning, it was about surviving and protecting Sofia, always protecting Sofia. Marco's footsteps echoed in the silence as he stalked through the house, flashlight flickering across scattered furniture and broken glass. His jaw was clenched, frustration simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not with this target. They'd walked into this job expecting compliance, not resistance. But this man, Carlos, was more than a simple suburban father. "Paolo, get up!" Marco barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Paolo groaned from the kitchen floor, clutching his arm where he had slammed into the counter. Luis was still unconscious, slumped against the cabinets. "This guy's insane, Marco," Paolo muttered, his voice tinged with panic. "We should just go." "We don't leave loose ends," Marco snapped, his glare shutting Paolo up. "He's playing games, but he'll slip. They always do." Upstairs, Carlos crouched in the narrow hallway, his breathing measured. He could hear Marco's anger reverberating through the house, each barked order reminding him of commanders he had once faced, or been. His mind raced, calculating every possible move. He was outnumbered but not outmatched. The real challenge was time. He had to keep them away from Sofia long enough for the situation to resolve itself, or for him to end it. Then, a chilling realization hit him. Marco's voice was getting closer. Carlos's stomach sank as he heard Marco's boots creak on the first step of the staircase. The leader was heading upstairs, toward Sofia. "No," Carlos whispered under his breath, his grip tightening around the crowbar. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to act, but he knew charging blindly would only get him killed. He needed to think, quickly. From the shadows, he hurled a small empty vase down the hallway, sending it clattering against the far wall. The noise echoed loudly and Marco froze on the stairs, his flashlight swiveling toward the sound. "Nice try," Marco muttered, smirking. But instead of moving toward the noise, he turned back to his original path, toward Sofia's room. Carlos's heart thundered as Marco approached her door. He had seconds to act. Suddenly, Marco spoke, loud enough for Carlos to hear. "Hey, whoever you are," he called, his voice taunting. "You're putting up a good fight, I'll give you that. But here's the thing." He kicked Sofia's door open with a thunderous crash, and Carlos felt his chest tighten with fear. "You don't have the leverage here, I do." Carlos heard a gasp from Sofia, muffled but unmistakable. She had been quiet, hidden just as he'd instructed, but now she was exposed. Marco's voice softened, almost mocking. "Well, what do we have here? A little girl? That's cute." Carlos moved without thinking. He was down the hall in seconds, barreling into Marco with the force of a freight train. The two men collided, crashing into the wall. Marco's flashlight clattered to the floor, plunging the hallway into near darkness. The fight was brutal and raw. Marco was strong, but Carlos was faster, fueled by sheer desperation. He drove a knee into Marco's stomach, sending him stumbling backward, but the leader recovered quickly, swinging a wild punch that grazed Carlos's jaw. Behind them, Sofia whimpered softly. "Stay down," Marco roared, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, its presence sending a jolt of cold fear through Carlos. "Not a chance," Carlos growled, his voice low and firm. He stepped back into a defensive stance, ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was personal. Marco had crossed a line and Carlos wasn't going to let him walk away. Carlos steadied himself, his body coiled like a spring as Marco brandished the knife. The dim hallway was charged with tension, every breath magnified in the silence. Behind him, Sofia remained pressed against the wall, her small figure trembling but silent, a testament to the trust she had in her father. Marco took a step forward, his smirk widening as he assessed his opponent. "You're good," he said, his voice calm but laced with venom. "Better than anyone I've dealt with in a long time. But I know you're not just some regular guy playing hero. Who are you, huh?" Carlos didn't answer. His mind raced, searching for an opening, a way to end this without risking Sofia. His silence seemed to amuse Marco, who tilted his head, the knife gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Let me guess," Marco continued, his tone taunting. "Ex-military? You move like someone who's seen combat." He chuckled darkly. "Funny, isn't it? You spend your life learning to kill and then you settle down, thinking you can just leave it all behind. But the past..." He gestured toward Sofia with the tip of the blade. "The past always finds a way to catch up." The words hit Carlos like a blow. Marco didn't just suspect, he knew. "What do you want?" Carlos demanded, his voice low and controlled, though his grip on the crowbar tightened. Marco's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "What I want," he said, stepping closer, "is justice." Carlos's brow furrowed, his confusion genuine. "Justice? For what?" "For what you did," Marco snarled, his voice rising. "Do you even remember me? Or were there too many faces for you to keep track of?" Carlos's mind reeled, trying to place Marco. The man's face was unfamiliar, but his eyes, burning with hatred, sparked a flicker of recognition. "You were there," Marco said, his tone turning icy. "In Cuerva del Sol. You and your team came storming through like saviors, but all you left was destruction. My family, my brother, they were nothing to you, just collateral damage in your war." The memory hit Carlos like a freight train. Cuerva del Sol. A name he hadn't thought of in years but would never forget. The mission had been brutal, a rebel stronghold, thick with enemies and civilians alike. Decisions had been made in seconds, lives measured against objectives. "I didn't," Carlos began, but his voice faltered. He could still see the smoke, hear the screams. He had followed orders, but that didn't make it right. It never made it right. Marco's eyes burned with unshed tears. You don't even remember their names, do you? But I remember yours, Carlos. I've been waiting for this moment. You took everything from me, and now I'm going to do the same to you. Carlos felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on his shoulders. He could see Marco's pain, his need for vengeance. But Carlos had Sofia to protect. He couldn't let his past destroy his present. Not again. I'm sorry, Carlos said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled, for what happened to your family. But you don't have to do this. This isn't justice. It's revenge. Marco's face twisted with rage. Revenge is all I have left. With that, he lunged, the knife flashing through the air. Carlos dodged, swinging the crowbar up to block the attack. The clash of metal echoed through the hallway as the two men grappled, each fighting with everything they had. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a collision of two paths, both scarred by violence, both desperate for resolution. Carlos's body ached, every muscle strained to its limit as he parried Marco's relentless attacks. The hallway felt suffocating, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of sweat and fear. Marco's knife slashed through the air, narrowly missing Carlos's arm. Each strike was fueled by rage, but Carlos fought with something stronger, purpose. Behind him, Sofia remained silent in the shadows, her small presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. Carlos's focus sharpened, his movements precise. He couldn't afford a mistake, but Marco wasn't slowing. His fury made him unpredictable, each swing of the knife coming faster, harder. Carlos stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. In that instant, Marco lunged, his blade slicing toward Carlos's chest. Before the knife could find its mark, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. Both men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. A shadow moved near the doorway, and Carlos's heart leapt into his throat. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw one of the intruders, Luis, the one he had incapacitated earlier, stagger into view. But instead of joining the fight, Luis raised his hands, his expression weary and conflicted. Enough, Luis said, his voice hoarse. He looked directly at Marco, his tone firm. This isn't what I signed up for. What? Marco spat, his grip on the knife tightening. You're just gonna walk away? After everything? Luis shook his head. This isn't right. The kid... He glanced toward Sofia's room, his face softening. She didn't do anything. This guy didn't do anything to us. You want to settle some grudge? Fine. But I'm out. You're a coward, Marco growled, his voice seething with contempt. Maybe, Luis replied, stepping back toward the door. But I'm not a monster. As Luis retreated, Carlos seized the moment of distraction. He swung the crowbar, knocking the knife from Marco's hand. It clattered to the ground, and Marco snarled, turning back to Carlos with fists raised. The two men collided again, their fight devolving into a brutal, desperate struggle. Meanwhile, Sofia, her small frame trembling, remembered her father's instructions. She knew she had to act. Crawling silently from her hiding place, she slipped down the hallway toward the stairs. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached the front door. Louis was gone, and the air outside was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. She darted down the front steps, her bare feet hitting the pavement. Her voice quivered as she called out, "Help! Someone help us!" Inside the house, Carlos caught a glimpse of her through the open doorway. Relief surged through him, but it was fleeting. Marco's fist connected with his jaw, sending him reeling. The fight wasn't over yet. Outside, Sofia's cries didn't go unanswered. Lights flickered on in nearby houses, and voices called out into the night. One neighbor, a wiry man in a bathrobe, rushed toward her with a phone in hand. "It's okay, sweetie," he said, kneeling beside her. "I've called the police. They're on their way." Back inside, the chaos reached a crescendo. Marco, realizing the tide was turning against him, made a final, desperate move. He lunged for Carlos, his hands reaching for the crowbar. But Carlos anticipated the attack, twisting the weapon free and using it to knock Marco off balance. The leader fell hard, landing on the floor with a thud. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, expectant. Carlos stood over Marco, his chest heaving, his grip on the crowbar firm but trembling. The faint sound of sirens broke through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Help was coming, but Carlos knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. But for Carlos, the sound was muted. His focus remained locked on Marco, who was sprawled on the floor, glaring up at him with eyes filled with hatred. The crowbar felt heavy in Carlos's hand, its weight a grim reminder of what he had been forced to do tonight. "You don't get it, do you?" Marco growled, pushing himself up onto one elbow. His lip was split, blood trickling down his chin. "You can't outrun your past, Carlos, no matter how many times you try to start over." Carlos didn't answer. Words felt futile. He stepped back, creating distance between himself and Marco, his mind racing. He had seconds, maybe less, before Marco tried something desperate. From behind him, Sophia's small voice broke through the tension. "Dad?" she called hesitantly, her voice trembling. Carlos turned his head slightly, enough to see her standing near the doorway, flanked by a neighbor who was holding her protectively. The sight of her, safe but terrified, ignited a fire within him. This had to end, now. Marco took advantage of the distraction, lunging forward with surprising speed. He grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and swung it toward Carlos, aiming for his midsection. Carlos barely dodged in time, the jagged edge grazing his side. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but it only fueled his determination. Using the momentum, Carlos twisted his body, slamming the crowbar down against Marco's wrist. The glass shard clattered to the floor, and Marco howled in pain. Carlos didn't stop. He knocked Marco back with a brutal shove, pinning him against the wall. "You think I don't know what I've done?" Carlos hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I don't carry that with me every single day? You're not the only one haunted by the past, Marco, but this..." He gestured toward the broken room around them. "This isn't justice, it's madness." Marco's chest heaved as he glared at Carlos, his fury mingling with something else, pain or maybe understanding. "You don't get to lecture me," Marco spat. "You're the reason they're gone. You took everything. And if you do this," Carlos countered, his voice steady, "you'll lose what little you have left. Don't let it define you the way it's defined me." For a fleeting moment, Marco's gaze flickered with uncertainty, but the sound of approaching footsteps snapped them both back to reality. Red and blue lights flashed through the shattered window, casting the room in sharp, strobing colors. "Police! Drop your weapon!" a voice boomed from outside. The sound of doors slamming and boots hitting pavement filled the air. Carlos let the crowbar fall from his hands, the metallic clang echoing in the tense silence. He stepped back, raising his hands slowly, as officers stormed the house, their weapons trained on him and Marco. "It's him," Carlos said, his voice firm as he gestured toward Marco. "He's the one you want." Marco didn't resist as the officers closed in, roughly pulling his arms behind his back and cuffing him. The fight had drained him of whatever energy he had left. His defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow stare. As the officers led Marco away, Carlos sank to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. A pair of steady hands gripped his shoulder, and he looked up to see Sophia standing there, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's over," she whispered, her small voice cutting through the chaos. Carlos pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her tightly. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to believe it. It was over. Carlos woke to blinding white light, his body heavy and unresponsive. The faint hum of medical machines surrounded him, their rhythmic beeping grounding him in reality. His first instinct was to move, to sit up, but a sharp pain radiating from his side stopped him cold. "Easy," a soft voice said. He turned his head slightly, his vision clearing enough to see Sophia sitting in a chair beside his bed. Her small hands clutched his, and her wide eyes glistened with relief. "You're okay, Dad," she whispered. Carlos exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing at the sight of her. She was safe. That was all that mattered. "Where?" he started, his voice hoarse. "The hospital," Sophia answered quickly, leaning forward. "The police brought us here. They said you were really brave." Memories of the night came flooding back. The fight, Marco's rage, the flashing lights of the police cars. He closed his eyes briefly, willing himself to stay in the moment. He couldn't let the memories drag him down. Not now. Before he could respond, the door opened and a uniformed officer stepped in. She was a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Martinez," she began, her tone professional but kind. "I'm Detective Harper. I just wanted to check in and update you on the situation." Carlos nodded weakly, his throat too dry to speak. "Marco and his crew are in custody," Harper continued. "We're building a solid case against them. Thanks to your quick thinking and your daughter's bravery, we were able to act before things got worse. Carlos glanced at Sophia, who ducked her head shyly at the compliment. Pride swelled in his chest despite the exhaustion. You should know, Harper added, her tone softening. Marco confessed to everything. He mentioned your history. It's clear there's a lot of pain there. For both of you. Carlos didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Marco's words from the night before echoed in his mind. You can't outrun your past. I didn't mean for any of it to happen, Carlos said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can't change what I've done. Harper nodded, her expression understanding. No, you can't. But you can choose what you do next. After a moment, she left, giving them some privacy. Sophia climbed onto the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle him. Are we going to be okay now? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Carlos hesitated, unsure how to answer. The scars of the night would linger for both of them, but as he looked into her eyes, he found his answer. Yes, he said firmly, squeezing her hand. We're going to be okay. Outside the window, the morning light was breaking over the city, warm and golden. It felt like a promise, a chance to begin again. For the first time in a long while, Carlos allowed himself to believe in it. The faint hum of a lawnmower drifted through the open window, mixing with the chirping of birds. The sunlight streamed into the living room, where Carlos sat on the couch, his side still bandaged but healing. Beside him, Sophia carefully arranged a tray of sandwiches and juice, her small hands working with precision. She beamed as she handed him a glass. Thanks, kiddo, he said with a smile, taking the glass and sipping slowly. It was a rare moment of calm, and Carlos let himself sink into it. The house still bore the scars of that night. The shattered window had been temporarily covered with plywood, and scratches on the walls were faint reminders of the chaos. But life was slowly returning to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. Neighbors had rallied around them, offering food, help with repairs, and words of support. For the first time since moving here, Carlos felt the warmth of a community. Dad, Sophia began, breaking the silence. Are you going to go back to work soon? Carlos looked at her, noting the hint of worry in her voice. He set the glass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Not right away, he admitted. I've got a few things to figure out first. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. You're still hurting? He smiled softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. A little, but I'm getting better, thanks to you. Sophia smiled, the weight on her young shoulders lifting slightly. She climbed onto the couch beside him, curling up with her favorite stuffed rabbit. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the chaos of the past few days feeling like a distant memory. Later that afternoon, Carlos made his way to the small desk in the corner of the living room. Among the scattered papers and mail was a flyer he had picked up earlier in the week. The bold letters read, Trauma Support Group, Healing Together. He had hesitated before grabbing it, unsure if he could bring himself to walk into a room full of strangers and bare his soul. But now, staring at the flyer, he felt something shift within him, a cautious hope. He turned the paper over in his hands, running his fingers along the edges. Sophia's voice broke his thoughts. Are you gonna go? She asked, standing behind him. He looked over his shoulder, her curious eyes meeting his. I think I might, he said. It could help. She nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of his decision. I think it's a good idea. The doorbell rang, startling them both. Sophia darted to answer it, revealing Mrs. R0bbers, their elderly neighbor, holding a basket of freshly baked empanadas. I made extra, she said, her smile warm. Thought you two could use a treat. Carlos thanked her, feeling a swell of gratitude. The neighborhood had become more than just a place to live. It was becoming a home. That night, as Carlos tucked Sophia into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. Do you think the bad guys will come back? She asked softly. No, he said, his voice steady. They're gone. And if they ever try, we'll be ready. Sophia nodded, her trust in him unwavering. As she drifted off to sleep, Carlos sat by her bedside, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think of the future, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He had a new purpose now, one far more important than any mission he had ever undertaken: protecting Sophia, building a life worth living. As he stood and walked back to his room, the darkness of the house didn't feel so heavy anymore. The dawn of a new chapter was just beginning. Sometimes, the greatest battles we face are not with others, but within ourselves, our past, our fears, and our need to protect those we love. Carlos's journey shows us the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the courage it takes to confront not only external threats, but also the ghosts of our own choices. How far would you go to protect what matters most? Would you face your darkest memories to secure a brighter future? Click the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore how our past can shape but not define who we are. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge you to reflect on the choices that truly matter. See you in the next chapter. Next.